The veteran we're interviewing today is Jerry Ford. Jerry is from Fairhope, and Jerry was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and he flew 219 air missions. He was in Korea as well as Vietnam, and he retired from the Army after 23 years, and I mentioned he's lieutenant colonel. And Jerry, what we'd like to ask you is, can you give us where you were born and some of your family details?
Sure. I was born in Mobile in 1944. I spent the first 18 years of my life in Mobile. Went to parochial schools. I graduated from McGill Institute, not McGill Tulane. I am married to former Charlotte Tate, who is from Columbus, Texas, and we met in New York City. We have two daughters, both of whom are in the service, or part of the service. One is on active duty, and the other is a reservist. My older daughter has been to Iraq and Afghanistan. She's an engineer, and my younger daughter just finished a tour in Afghanistan. My older daughter is married to an Air Force officer, and he is stationed at Tyndall Air Force Base. We have one grandchild, just recently, Emily Burke Friedel, and we live in Fairhope, obviously.
Okay, so we'd like to know a little bit about where'd you go to school? I mean, Big Bill Tulane, but did you go to college?
I did. Out of high school, I went to Loyola University of New Orleans, and I graduated in 1967 with a degree in business administration.
And did you go right into the Army after that?
Yes. While I was at Loyola, I had to take 2 years of ROTC because it's a land grant school. And when I finished those 2 years, I was invited to continue, and I had such a heavy class load because I went to a Catholic university, and I had to take philosophy and theology that I just thought that it would be better if I had a choice that I could drop something and it was going to be ROTC. I honestly did not think at the time that I was going to have to go into the military, although my mother had worked for the Air Force for 25 years at Brooklyn Air Force Base, encouraged it. She either wanted me to be a priest or go into the military. But I just never really thought that I was going to have to. I guess I just kind of put it out of my mind. But as I got closer to graduation, the draft board in Mobile began to tell me that I was going to have to do something. So I first went to the Air Force recruiter in New Orleans and talked to them about going into the Air Force, and they said, sure, we'll test you. So I took a physical exam, and I took a written exam and passed all of that. And the Air Force had actually accepted me to go into pilot training and said that they could get me into the Air Force in September of '67. The draft board in Mobile said that wasn't going to work. I had to get into the service before August. They had a quota, and I had to do something. I had a very good friend who many people in this area know, Dr. Sam Eichel, who lived next door to me. And Dr. Sam was very involved with the Navy. And so I went to see him and I said, Dr. Sam, I need to do something. And he said, well, I can get you to the Naval Reserve. And so I thought seriously about doing that. But while I was in college, my last year in college, there was a young lady who sat behind me in several of my classes whose boyfriend was going through Army OCS. And she gave me a hard time. She kept telling me that she didn't think that I was man enough to make it through Army OCS. And it kind of stuck in my mind. And so that summer of 1967, while I was trying to decide what to do, one day I woke up and I said, I have got to do something in my life. So I went to see the Army recruiter, and I said, I'm a college graduate, and I'd like to go to OCS. And he said, no problem, son, you're in. And I went up to Montgomery. I went to Montgomery 3 times that summer on the Gray Dog. That was before Interstate 65, and if any of you who are watching this video know anything about what it was like to travel on the Gray Dog to Montgomery back in those days on a Sunday afternoon, you'd know how miserable that was. But I got inducted in September of '67.
Okay, and after you were in this, after you got through pilot training, what went on then?
Finished in OCS. We had toward the end of OCS, a 6-month OCS in the Army. Back in those days, you had to go through basic training, 8 weeks, then AIT, Advanced Individual Training, to have a specialty, which was infantry for me because I was going to go to infantry OCS. And then from there, and that was at Fort Dix, by the way, and that's where I met my wife. She was at Fordham University, and my sister was going to Fordham University. And I know this is a little aside, but I was looking for a date one weekend, and I had a pass and went to New York, and I met my future wife at Fordham. We didn't marry for several years later, but I did meet her there. But anyway, went through basic and AIT at Fort Dix, and then OCS at Fort Benning. And while we were in OCS, there was a problem that we went out on, a ranger problem, where we were out with the Rangers for 10 days, and this was June of '67. It was really hot. And toward the end of that problem, the student pilots from Fort Rucker came over in their helicopters and picked us up and moved us 4 or 5 kilometers in the amount of time it would take us maybe 4 or 5 days to do it in seconds. And I said, this sounds like a pretty good deal here. So I started looking into Army aviation, and I always wanted to fly. And they had recruiters there at Fort Benning who were trying to get people to, when they graduated, to go into aviation. And I volunteered, and I took the test and passed the test and passed the physical. So when I graduated from OCS, I already had orders to go to flight school. It took 3 or 4 months. I stayed on in the same unit that I was in. I stayed on as a TAC officer in the OCS company. But in October of '68, I started flight school at Fort Walters, Texas. It was split in half. Flight school was at that time 4 months at Fort Walters and then 4 months at Fort Rucker, and it was all temporary duty. We actually had orders. We were assigned to a unit in Vietnam, but the whole time we were in flight school, we were on temporary duty. They paid us TDY pay. As a matter of fact, I went from being insolvent to rich all of a sudden. It was, I was actually making payments on a TV set that I bought in Columbus, Georgia, of $10 a month, and my balance was going up because of the interest rates on the TV set. But then all of a sudden, they started paying us $450 a month tax free in '68. That was a lot of money, and also we got flight pay. But anyway, did basic helicopter training at Fort Walters, Texas, in TH-55s, which is a little Hughes helicopter that you see on TV every once in a while. And then went to Fort Rucker, and we did instrument training first, and then we transitioned into UH-1s. And as a graduate from flight school, we were supposed to go almost immediately to Vietnam because we were assigned to Vietnam. Toward the end of flight school, the Army in its infinite wisdom came to us and said, those of us who were infantry officers in that class, we don't need you in Vietnam right now. We have too many infantry officers in Vietnam. So I got assigned to a unit at Fort Hood, Texas, when I graduated from flight school. My really 2 very, very good friends of mine and I got an apartment at Fort Hood, and we started working in this unit at West Fort Hood, Texas. They had 12 helicopters, of which maybe 1 might work. I mean, this is Vietnam, and there were no units in the States who were actually flying. We had 1 duty, and that duty was lifesaver, which was a precursor to life flight. Mm-hmm. We would do 36 hours on and 36 hours off, and a lot of times we'd look out on the helipad, and the commanding general of 3 Corps or 3-star general's helicopter would be parked there. That's what we'd be using, because none of our helicopters worked. We couldn't get them in the air, and it was not a good assignment. And so I started calling the Department of the Army saying, I want to go to Vietnam. I know I'm going, and I want to go. And one day I called them and they said, well, would you be willing to go to fixed wing school? And I had never even considered asking, because it was, you don't go to fixed wing school after rotary school. I mean, it just wasn't done. Old pilots who had been flying for years tried to get into fixed wing school for rotary wing, and they couldn't do it. And I said, yeah, I'll do that. And so I went from Fort Hood to Fort Stewart, Georgia, where I learned to fly bird dogs, O-1s. They're a single-engine Cessna tail dragger. 1950, the tail numbers were all 1950, 1951. That's when they were built. Mm-hmm. And from there, I went to Fort Rucker, where we did instrument training and actually got a full instrument ticket, which you didn't get in rotor wing school. It was something that they called a tactical instrument ticket, but nobody knew how to fly instruments. So they actually taught us how to fly instruments. And then in May of 1970, after 3 years in the Army, I finally made my way to Vietnam.
You mentioned also that you did some, you were in Korea too for a little bit.
I was. In Korea, by that time, it was 7 years later. In Korea, I was assigned to a CH-47 Chinook unit, which I transitioned into, and I have more hours in Chinooks than anything else. I was the operations officer and the company commander of a company that had 16 Chinooks in it. We had, it was absolutely a wonderful mission, except for the fact that I left my wife and my first daughter back home. I loved it. I loved every minute of it because we flew all the time, and we actually took the Chinooks out and did what they were supposed to do. We hauled heavy stuff on sling loads inside the cargo bay, but it was just an absolute. We took USO shows around. We hauled nuclear weapons out of Korea. We picked up building materials at the bottom of a mountain, picked it up with a sling load, took it up to the top of the mountain, and put it down on LZs that the pilots could not see because they were so small. We'd be hanging out over the top of the mountain, and the crew chief, who was looking down through the hellhole, was the one who had told us where to position the load so we could put it down on the ground. But it was a fantastic mission. I just absolutely loved it.
How long did you do that for?
That was a year. I was
Just
there
a
for a year, yes.
And then you'd go back to Vietnam? Or was that after
It
Vietnam?
was, this was 1977, 78, yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit about Vietnam if I could.
Sure.
In Vietnam, I didn't even know whether or not I was going to go and fly fixed wing or rotary wing. No one ever told me. And I came into Vietnam at a kind of a back door. I had orders for the Air Force Jungle Survival School at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, which very few people also got to do. I have no idea why. I mean, the Army. But I went to this Air Force Jungle Survival School. It was a week long, and it was really a good school. They taught us all about what you could eat, what you couldn't eat, what you had to be aware of. And the final phase of that school was they took us out on the mountains up above Clark Air Force Base, their jungle, and dropped us and said, you have to escape and evade back to this place. We had a compass, and all of us, of course, could read a compass. We didn't have a map, but we did have a compass. And, oh, by the way, they told us that we pay the locals, the Negritos, a bag of rice for every American that they catch, and they're after you. So you have to get down to this LZ without them catching you. So I'm surrounded by all these Air Force pilots, and I mean, you have to understand fighter pilots and what they're like. But I thought, I am not going to get caught. They're not going to catch me. So I listened to everything they said, and I went out, and that night while we were escaping and evading, I said, I'm going to find a place to go. Well, they told us, they kept saying, don't climb the trees because these big rats are in the trees. So the first thing I did was climb a tree. And I got up in the tree, and they didn't find me, and I made it. I was able to escape and evade. But from there, I went to Vietnam. Well, when I left Clark Air Force Base, I got on a commercial airplane to go into Tan Son Nhut. And most soldiers who went into Tan Son Nhut came in on a charter, and they were met at that charter and taken straight to a place called Camp Alpha, where they were given their assignments, and then they went and drew their whatever uniforms they were supposed to get, and they went off to their assignments. Well, all the commercial airliner did, which was, I guess, Thai Airlines, I'm not sure, they just dropped us there, and we just got off and went into the terminal just like anybody else. We had dollar bills on us, which was strictly illegal. It was all military personnel, military currency in Vietnam, and no one ever took our money from us or anything. So fortunately, I was with a guy who knew where to go. He took us to Camp Alpha, and I wound my way through the bureaucracy and wound up in Pleiku in the Central Highlands in Vietnam. I was assigned to the 219th Aviation Company, which was a bird dog company. And we had a platoon also in Kon which was about 40 kilometers north of Pleiku. I wasn't married at the time, and the company commander asked me if I would like to fly the mission that he called MAC-SOG, and I said, well, what is it? And he said, well, I'll let them brief you if you think you might want to fly it. And I said, okay, because I wasn't married. You had to be, you couldn't be married. So I went up to Kon and I went to the Command and Control Central, the 5th Special Forces Group compound, and they verified my clearance, and they said, okay, this is the mission. And our mission was to fly into Cambodia and Laos every day, doing command and control and visual reconnaissance for the Special Forces who were in Cambodia and Laos, although they weren't supposed to be, and they were leading mountain yards and Nung tribesmen on patrols, observing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the infiltration from North Vietnam. And I did that for a year. I never flew in Vietnam except from the airport in Kon Tum to cross the border. I never flew a mission in Vietnam. Every single one was in Cambodia and Laos.
How long did you stay in Vietnam?
I stayed there a year.
Just a year. And then from there, where'd you go?
I went to, I got orders to Fort Polk, Louisiana. By that time I was a captain. I took command of a basic training company at Fort Polk. Fort Polk was a really interesting place back then. There were 2 permanent buildings on Fort Polk, a chapel and a dental clinic. Everything else was World War II barracks. I had 4 barracks. I had an orderly room that contained my arms room, and I had a mess hall. I owned my own mess hall. They don't do that anymore, but I had my own. I had a mess sergeant. Actually, it was just a wonderful assignment. I loved it. My wife and I got married while we were there. Our first assignment, we were together, and it was really great. We loved it. Stayed there for 3 years.
And about when did you retire?
I retired in 1990. At the time I retired, I was the professor of military science at Central Missouri State University.
Okay. So how long were you there?
I was there 2 years.
2 years.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So after you got discharged or retired from the Army, what did you do after that? Well,
one of my duties when I was at Central Missouri was to go to Kansas City and inspect the JROTC units in Kansas City. I really didn't know anything about JROTC, but I was given the opportunity to go and do all the inspections. Kansas City has a very large JROTC contingent. I think practically every public school in Kansas City had JROTC, and historically, at that time, there was a judge in Kansas City who had told the school system how much money they had to spend on the high schools, and it was like, it was a very complicated and controversial ruling that he was actually saying, you cannot let your high schools continue to deteriorate like this, and this is what you have to do. So the Kansas City school system became all magnet. Every high school had a different theme magnet. There was an entertainment magnet. There was a just law and justice magnet. There was a health magnet, and one of them was also a military magnet. But they all had JROTC. So I became familiar with JROTC and began talking to them about retirement when I was going to have to retire soon, whether or not there'd be a position for me. And the director of Army Instruction, who was over all the units there, said, yes, absolutely, we'd love to have you. So I began to look into it, and at the same time, my mother died in 1986. This is 88, 89, and my father was very ill, and he died in 89. And I had come back to Mobile and realized that Mobile had a very big JROTC contingent also. So I went to see the gentleman who was in charge of Mobile schools and asked him if he thought he was going to have any openings in the next few years, and he said, yeah, he knew that he was going to have several if I was interested, and I said, well, I am. And so I left an application with the Mobile Public Schools. He called me in July of 1990 and said, I have 3 openings. He said, would you like to come down and interview? And so I talked to my wife and my 2 daughters, and they said, you know, Mobile is fine. If that's where you want to go, then, you know, we've always enjoyed it there. So I went and interviewed, and I was offered all three jobs, and took the one at Mary Montgomery High School in Sims, and had to retire within a month. And I worked for a very good man, and he understood, and so I was able to get it done. And actually was still on active duty when I started teaching at Mary Montgomery.
So you retired in 1990.
August of 1990.
And then you continued doing JROTC?
I did JROTC at Mary Montgomery for 3 years, and then I taught at Blount for 14 years.
Okay. And then you retired?
Then I retired from the school system, yes.
Okay. And you live in Fairhope, right?
I do live in Fairhope, yes, okay, with my wife and my children's dogs.
Well, you mentioned that your daughters were also did time in the service too.
Yeah, I would like to say something about my daughters because I'm so very proud of them. My older daughter went to college on an ROTC scholarship. She says, "I always did what you wanted to do, Daddy." So, you know, she throws that up at me every once in a while. But she went to Alabama on an ROTC scholarship, and she's an engineer. She became an engineer, a civil engineer. And when she graduated, she actually, at my urging, went to jump school, which was, I told her, I said, you know, if that badge means something. I said, you know, when you walk in to see somebody, you got that badge on your chest, it means something to people. And I'm airborne qualified, and I told her, I said, it means more. So she did that. And her first assignment was Hawaii. She went to Hawaii and was assigned to the non-divisional engineer battalion, which is attached to the 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii. And during her tour there, she was there 4 years. During her tour there, she actually deployed twice once to East Timor, when we were helping out after the revolution there in East Timor, which is a really ugly place. I don't know if you know anything about what was going on there, but it was dangerous. And but she went by herself, a second lieutenant, maybe first lieutenant at the time, with her platoon to East Timor and did engineer projects. They built schools, worked on some other civic action stuff for 6 months, and then later on in her assignment, she took her platoon again and went to a small island in Micronesia called Koh Sarai, and in Koh Sarai they did almost exactly the same thing. When she returned, she wasn't sure what she was going to do when she returned from Hawaii, but she finally decided that she was going to get out, and through networking she was able to get a job inside the Beltway in D.C. at an engineering firm. I think she was there 3 months before Iraq occurred in 1990. In 2000, and she was called up in 2002.
She's still in reserves then, right?
She was still in the reserves, and she was called up, and was one of the very first people to go into Iraq. She and her engineer team, they were an engineer. They did infrastructure. They rebuilt the infrastructure. She and her engineer team were one of the first ones to actually walk into Iraq the day the war started. And they wound up going to Balad, which is a huge base now, when there was absolutely nothing there. I mean, they lived in trailers. Bodily functions were done in a ditch. It was really interesting, but she was there for a year. She came back. My younger daughter went to Auburn, and she graduated with a degree in journalism, and had worked for the paper in Dothan for a while, and then worked for the paper, then went to work in Panama City. My older daughter, when she came back from Iraq, wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she took my younger daughter to Panama City to look for a place to live, fell in love with it, and bought a house there. My older daughter did. She didn't have a job at the time, but she had potential. And so she and my younger daughter moved into this house. Neither one of them married. And my younger daughter continued to teach for 2 years. Meanwhile, my older daughter met her future husband, an Air Force officer. And they, they decided that they were going to get married, so they were going to wind up having to sell that house. So my younger daughter kind of saw the light, and she said, I'm going to have to do something. I'm starving to death as a journalist. So she joined the Army as a private and went to Officer Candidate School, just like me. I actually got to speak at her at the dining in before her graduation at Fort Benning. Her company commander asked me to come up there and do the address to them, and I was really honored to do that. She's been on active duty since then, and has also since then gotten married to a gentleman from Panama City who is in the real estate business. At this moment, she has just gotten back from her tour in Afghanistan. Her unit was stationed in Germany. She has been stationed. She did a tour in Korea, and then went to Germany. Her unit went from Germany to Afghanistan for a year, to Kandahar, and they just returned. And she and her husband have just been reunited, and they are on their way to Greece today. I got an email from them, and they're going to go spend a couple of days in Greece. My wife and my older daughter and my other son-in-law and my granddaughter are going to join them next week in Germany when they come back for a reunion.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Well, it sounds like you had a very interesting career, as well as your family had an interesting career too.
Yeah, I think maybe theirs might be more interesting than mine, to be honest with you.
Well, we certainly appreciate your time that you put in for the service and for the part of our service to the country, and we really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Could you explain how the recon works and how the information gets back to the special forces?
Yeah, I can. A Bird Dog is a two-seater airplane, so it's tandem, one behind the other. So we would take one of the team members would come over and get in the back seat, and we'd take them out to communicate with the people on the ground. Our call sign was SPAF, S-P-A-F. It stood for Sneaky Pete Air Force. The Air Force was also out there, and they had different airplanes. They used O2s, which is a push-pull airplane with twin tail booms. It's actually a civilian airplane, and they use OV-10 Broncos, which is a military airplane that the Air Force and the Marine Corps both used. We would communicate with the people on the ground by radio, by secure radio. Many times they'd be whispering because they were within meters, few meters of the enemy, and they'd be reporting back to us what they were seeing, who was coming down the trail and who wasn't, and what they were doing. There was also in southern Laos, a really jungly, mountainous area, an outpost that was codenamed Leghorn. The NVA tried really hard to get there, to get the people who were there, but they never were able to do it. But Leghorn also communicated with the people on the ground. As kind of an aside, but I participated in Operation Tailwind, and you may remember, may not, but Newsweek did an expose of Operation Tailwind about 5 years ago, where they claimed that the Army used poison gas on the NVA in Laos in Operation Tailwind. That's absolute nonsense, because the soldiers that we took into Tailwind were Nung, tribesmen, and Montagnards, and they didn't even have masks. They were not provided with gas masks at all. Tailwind was a mess, and there was a lot of bad things that happened, but there was certainly no poisonous gas. We flew so far out into Laos on that mission that we were told that if you get in trouble, don't come back, go to Thailand. And we had the call signs for the air bases in Thailand where we were supposed to go, where we were able to get back. But we went out and we took visual reconnaissance. We were the first ones to go out there. Another Army captain and I, in another airplane, we flew high-low, and we were actually the first ones to go out and do visual observation of this area where Tailwind went. It was a huge staging area, a great big open plain area on the other side of the mountains in Thailand. And we were on top of them so quickly that they really didn't have time to react, but there was tanks and trucks, troops. It was a very intimidating sight.
That's fascinating. I remember reading a little bit about that.
Tailwind. Yeah,
Yeah.
It was a big deal, but it was actually many people discounted. There were a lot of people that were involved in Tailwind, and they discounted the story because it was nonsense. It was,
Yeah.
the story that they told was they had no idea what they were talking about. We didn't send anyone out there with a gas mask or with protective suits or anything like. We didn't use gas. I mean, those guys. I can just see someone trying to teach a mountain yard or a Nung how to wear a gas mask. Or we didn't do that.
Well, we certainly, again, thank you for that aside. We appreciate that.
Well,
That's something a lot of people don't know about.
that may be true.
Okay.
It's not classified anymore.
No.
I know. I checked. So it was for a while.
Okay. All right, thanks again, Jerry,
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, wonderful interview, thank you.
Thank you. That was my pleasure, by the way. I enjoyed that.